You were this close. Wasn't for that late payment on your electric bill, we might have did it.
No, I didn't. That's John said. Okay.
Or just one. Yeah.
All right. Take
Shows the spectrum of even though area.
That makes sense.
What you actually see in the median data there is.
Where are they rated?
No, they were having some issues. I got it. figured out,
Okay, so we're good, we're live. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say it's good here.
And then even. All right, good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and call the April 16th meeting of the Fiscal Affairs and Audit Standing Committee to order. Big thanks to Doug and everybody here at the Pitt State campus for hosting us this morning. We will begin by considering approval of the minutes from the March 12th committee meeting. Any discussion on the minutes from last month's meeting? If not, we'll entertain a motion to approve.
I'll move to approve.
Okay, we have a motion from Regent Rawl. Second from Regent Dykens. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, any follow-up on issues related to our April 1st agenda call? Notes don't indicate any.
Well, we will have a follow-up, Regent Benson, on the question from Regent Dykes about the project approvals for capital items that come in over budget at a subsequent time. So speeding up that process a bit. We'll have an update on that.
Excuse me, thank you. All right, we'll move on to new business then. We have a presentation from Jim McMurray, who's the Senior Vice President for Finance for the Kansas Department Kansas Development Finance Authority. So Jim, thanks so much for making the drive and joining us this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Good to see you again. I am Jim McMurray with the Kansas Development Finance Authority, and we'll spend probably 10 to 15 minutes here speaking regarding college or university finances and a little bit market update first. So turning to the second slide. Being a finance guy, I always have to talk about the markets a little bit, but I'll cater the comments a little bit more towards the municipal market, which may not be necessarily on your radar. So not a surprise, there's a lot of uncertainty in the market right now. A lot of federal policy changes, proposals, implementation, perhaps implementation being stayed by court actions on any number of things, but especially regarding tariffs. This disincentivizes risk taking due to higher credit spreads. Last week had 3 days where the 30-year municipal market data, which is an index for municipal bonds, had 3 days where 30-year municipal market data index increased by 20 basis points, 0.2% or more. To put that in context, since the turn of the century, there's been 15 instances where that happens in a day. 3 of them happened last week. No surprise at the top of the list, a similar circumstance, different cause was COVID. The key driver here is uncertainty. When you have the uncertainty, credit spreads go up. So, safer assets have the opportunity to actually be bought opportunistically. That may or may not happen in terms of U.S. Treasuries here. So there's another dynamic there in terms of foreign trade and foreign investment. But riskier assets, become discounted in value, therefore yields go up. Okay. The 30-day tariff pause, provided some relief last week, on Thursday time range. But year to date, the 30-year MMD is up 61 basis points. That's not on the slide there. It's a little email I got from market close yesterday. 60 basis points for the year. The 30-year treasury, comparable maturity is even for the year. So, municipal credits are, existing credit is, existing bonds a lot cheaper, therefore the yields are higher. Okay, without accounting for any underlying fundamentals, credits of the character of the institution or borrower. Okay. Also, in times of uncertainty, liquidity becomes more valuable. Those that have it are in better position to navigate, whereas those that don't have it can find themselves in delicate positions. Fortunately, some of the recent pricings for the Regions institutions happened before the majority of this uncertainty and increase in credit spreads. In particular, Wichita State was in the market March 4th. Those priced very well in the relative sense of where we're sitting today. And then Kansas Athletics was also later in March and got hit by a little bit of this dynamic, but not all of it. Moving on, recapping last year's discussion, you may recall that I kind of pounded the little table a little bit on margins and then also some reporting requirements when the institutions seek debt approval. So in the first bullet, we had suggested that KBOR require universities include debt burden ratio, average debt service coverage, and viability ratio as defined in KBOR policy manual at the time of each debt authorization. I believe Elaine headed that up and got that implemented. So some improvement on process helps put more information on the table. So when it's time to make a decision, better decisions can be made. And then also in that meeting, I emphasized the importance of having margin. I want to reiterate that message today. And words don't just come from my mouth; they come from Moody's, and I imagine S&P has something very similar. And then if you talk to any credit analysts, they will have similar thoughts. Having a margin, and in this case, Moody's EBITDA, as a core aspect of the university's operating performance is its earnings before interest, depreciation, and more amortization margin. Its operating performance is important for the long-term financial health of all higher education institutions, but is especially critical for those that do not have significant financial reserves. So think about some of your institutions that have research enterprises, have a very large alumni base, have established large endowments, whereas you have other institutions that don't have those effects. They have less resources to draw upon in times of stress. So,
are the endowments seen as liquid, even though most of them are restricted gifts or towards programs already?
Yeah. So specifically on Moody's. Getting into the credit factors, they just straight up say size matters. And that translates into several of the metrics on their scorecard. They fully realize that they're not necessarily liquid, but they're also the sign of you or I have rather than on a comparative basis.
Is it reasonable to expect that if the Trump administration goes to war with Harvard's endowment, that drains that, removes its tax exempt status, and that would impact rating agencies, how they look at that?
Yeah. If that's going to have an effect.
How secure that?
Now, Harvard in particular, just the size of their endowment, they've got lots of runway to deal strategically with that effect. You can't get higher than AAA, and that means people up the AAA may, on a comparative basis, be a lot farther ahead than another AAA, just because you can't go beyond that upper limit. They just have so much advantage in terms of being so far ahead in the game so far, have the reputation, and they can literally pick who they want out of the application process. So I think it could have a very material impact, and of course, the credit rating agencies would focus on that and, account for that. But I think someone like Harvard is so far ahead in the game, they've got a lot of run room.
Well, yeah, the playbook was laid out early in the administration, but if there's penalties that are brought against endowments and there's chunks taken out of endowments, what's seen as a pretty secure asset, so to speak. It's a group of assets, but
Yeah, I mean, they
I
would.
don't know what that's
they
gonna
would-
do to
They would probably hear
our
about it.
ability to raise debt.
Well, yeah, I mean, if that goes down to smaller institutions in terms of, coming claim on the endowment, or, they start paying taxes or something like that. It will be, once there's clarity on what the impact will be, they will incorporate that into. But I think there needs to be some clarity and certainty of what that policy is and how it will be implemented before they're gonna act precipitously. Rating agencies usually are not on the front edge of the wave, they're kind of on the back edge of it. Okay, turning back to our discussion on margin, if you look at the rating methodology, they kind of have a spectrum of putting people in different buckets on that criteria, and it's a very wide spectrum of on the grading scale, like having EBITDA margins over 22.5% versus slightly negative EBITDA margins. But if you look at their actual medians data for each of the rating categories, it clusters around 11%. And if we flip the slide and look at the historicals, which is a busy line graph, which is okay for our purposes. Left side of the scale is full scale, 0 to 25% on EBITDA margin. The bottom scale is 2015 through 2024. The 6 individual institutions are labeled there. I would argue that the main point is not to see what any individual particular institution is doing or has done, but they all kind of ease into that median value of 11%, which is over the long term a good place to be. So your institutions have done a good job navigating the last 10 years on managing their EBITDA margin. So even though I pounded the table a bit on this last year, it's something that to sustain, there isn't any kind of corrective action or recommended action beyond what we've already done from last year. So next slide, please. Now I do want to talk about liquidity, especially given the kinds of uncertainty we're in. Margin is not the only thing, you also need liquidity. I suggest the KBOR reinforces its guidance on liquidity. The policy manual does say something about financial reserves. And I've quoted that paragraph there around 2 to 3 sentences. It is a very generalized statement. Universities shall maintain sufficient resources to manage risks, to recognize commitments, and to take advantage of opportunities. That is good philosophical language. I think you probably need to think about either at the KBOR level or the institution level, put some rubber on that tire and on the road in terms of implementation. I know at least some of the institutions have to some degree, but I think you probably want to ask them what their liquidity policy is. And then I do know that you get reports on the composite financial index each year for each of the institutions, and that CFI index does include as one of its components the primary reserve rate ratio, which is, the best factor in that index in terms of measuring liquidity. It's expendable net assets to total expenses, which is a reasonable measure for liquidity. I prefer to focus on number of days cash on hand, which is a little bit more intuitive. You do this primary reserve ratio. And yes, you have a number. Yes, it's measurable. Yes, it's data-based, but intuitively, when you look at it, it's a little hard to conceptualize.
What's typically the minimum days on hand that you would use to qualify as sufficient?
I'm going to handle that on the next slide.
Good question. Yeah, I'll hold my question.
Yeah.
Were you on this slide? What's the definition of expendable? And how quickly?
That is very important, and I don't know enough about the CFI to see how they've implemented that, and it's very easy, who's doing the analysis, how consistent are they, how effectively do they communicate to the end user what is actually there and not. Moody's, unfortunately, in the change of rating criteria in 2021, actually they used to have liquidity as measured as days cash on hand, and they called it monthly days cash on hand. It was your ability to achieve liquidity on your assets within 30 days. So what assets were at 30-day liquidity, and then did that over annual expenses, and then calculated days on hand by multiplying by 360 to 365. So yeah, good question. I don't have a firm answer, but whenever you do the analysis, it's important to establish
I assume in regard to that definition, the one key is 30 days, it has to be available in 30 days. I assume also there's a requirement to be available without a serious haircut, without a serious discount.
Right.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're at some point, if you're going to apply this in a broad universe, you have so many institutions that do things slightly different way. But usually on your accounting, their GASB prepared statements, you have cash and cash equivalents. That would kind of be the default area.
Okay.
Of saying,
Thank you.
it's actually cash. So getting back to the slide deck here, days cash on hand is a common measure of liquidity that perhaps is a bit more intuitive than the primary reserve ratio. Literally, how many days do days until I run out of cash if revenues go to zero and expenses stay constant? Remember, even big financial firms have the right that those people in room crash and burn. And we saw that in the Great Recession.
So when you say cover days on or expenses, what is that all expenses?
For simplicity, they take the most recent annual total expenses as what your daily expense divided by 360 would be your daily expense. And we know that's not fact, right? Things are lumpy through the year, but for the sake of consistency across organizations, comparative, that's what you typically do. I mean, if you've got a really top-notch financial, staff, I mean, you would probably do a daily cash projection. But that takes time and effort to do, and what's your value? I mean, do you need a daily cash balance, or can you go week to week or month to month? Okay, so again, the 6 institutions, full scale number of days on the left-hand scale, 0 to 350 days. Time window 2015 and 2024, all 6 institutions. So 150 days cash on hand is a great target, or a good target at least. Probably a lot of comfort there. As you go lower, I don't know where the line is to say your policy is too high, too low, or whatever. But certainly under 50 is too low. And we are in this instance talking about WSU. They have had a lot of good things happen in the last several years. Stimulate, and are going to benefit tremendously in the long term. But it has been a drain on their liquidity. So they're in a delicate position right now. And I know they know about it. I know they've started to take corrective action and have other levers to pull, but it is something to pay attention to.
Part of the reimbursement rate also, or is it just all the capital budget?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting story actually for WSU, and I'm really glad that we're talking about it because for all of us, I don't know about my colleagues, but I look at the days of cash and our cash balances on pretty much a weekly basis each month. And so, for WSU, if you go back to 2016, that's when the innovation campus started to come online. And that's when WSU started to change its focus to be a research institution. And as you go from 2016 to today in 2024, and this is all driven largely by the research story in WSU. And so in 2016, our R&D research was at $65 million. Today, we're almost at $400 million. But one of the challenges for WSU is that a lot of that research is federal Department of Defense. And for federal contracts, those are almost always reimbursable after you do the work. And so, a great example for us that we're working through right now is the Sierra Nevada contract for the Air Force's Doomsday plane. That's a 4-year, $400 million contract. And as that comes online, and we've already started work on it, there's a 3-month window when you start the work versus when you actually receive your first reimbursement. And so there's an investment in the startup there. And, it's an interesting balance for us because we're also an economic driver in our community. This is something that the research portion of this and the Department of Defense and then fitting into the aviation sector within Wichita. It is a delicate balance for us to balance out the economic development for our region as well as managing our own finances here.
And there's another aspect I might bring up, Regents, and Jim, you might reference this too. Educating our policymakers, our legislators to understand why an institution like a community college or a state university, for example, need to have cash on hand and to function for day-to-day operations and to address capital needs as well. That has been a hot topic with the 2025 legislature for our community colleges. And they don't always quite understand that dynamic well enough, but they're making decisions about state funding absent some understanding of that sometimes. So that's a challenge for us.
As we talk about a policy here, one thing I would just outline, for WSU, what I see though is that, we're working to improve this, but most likely we're always going to be an outlier on the lower end of these measures. And even as you look at our peers in the Moody's ratings, we're on the lower edge there in relation to our rating, and we always have been.
Simply because of the amount of federal work that you're doing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you agree that the chart was points too low? You think it is too low really, or?
Yes, absolutely.
If so, what's your goal to improve over what period of time?
Yeah, so we've been concentrating on the research side and improving those margins there. That involves both looking at research rates as well as, what contracts do we take, what are worth the risk of the startup costs and when those begin. The other dynamic for us that I might outline for you that sets us a little bit apart from the other research institutions is that for the industry and defense programs, all of our employees, including researchers, are contingent employees, meaning that we can essentially let them go within a very short period of time. And that gives us another lever to pull as we work through, potential cash issues. A benefit for us, though, I think, is because we do concentrate on Department of Defense research work. The federal issues so far really have not confronted us yet. It's a balance.
Thank you.
Way to make these slides bigger.
Let me see what we can do over here.
You can stand closer to the TV.
From the movie theater.
A little too close to you.
Wow.
Ouch.
Wow. You notice where I was at.
I said something that you be within. Motion just.
If I could maybe weigh in on the days cash on hand and kind of pulling more on Elaine's comments. We've been talking a lot about this internally at the university. It's a real struggle that we have. We understand where the rating agencies view and what they prioritize and how they value days cash on hand. But the real struggle is we get in front of the legislature and they're looking at individual funds and balances. The threat is very real that they take policy actions against us because they're not understanding that it's two opposing viewpoints, right? Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real concern that we've had is, that they're going to look at these individual balances and the individual funds and take action on it. And so we've been balancing between trying to set a bare minimum threshold that we want the university and individual units to have within their operations. And that's kind of where we've been landing internally is to say, we want at least 100 days cash on hand.
Sure.
And that's kind of how we've been talking about, because we want to try to minimize risk here and actions that could happen here while we understand what is needed on the other side.
Valid point.
Just to build on that, and this is a hot topic, I'm sure for all of us. It's really a hot topic when your F&A money is being targeted and may be in jeopardy because margins, this discussion of margins and reserves, I'm having that weekly, if not daily, with leadership at the university as we say, what's the impact of this policy? What's the impact of that policy? The part that is a good graph to kind of get a total feel. And you'll see a comment in his next slide or so about KU where relative to our median peers, we're around 150 days. Where the median for our peers are around 180 days. So we're like at 5 months, medians at 6 months. But it all depends on the risk you have. So housing, in my opinion, housing has a different reserve requirement than does research. Research needs 60 days for a government shutdown. So your research funding, you need F&A money around 60 days because you may be shut down that long and you got to keep your research going. So that's sort of the policy we have there. And then on housing, we have a policy. And then on university, and a medical center is different than a regular university. So that's kind of the blended average of all that. But what we went through an exercise 3 years ago is what is the relative risk that we're protecting ourselves with in a downturn? And how much cash do you need to get through that risk? That's the analysis. So the 150 number he has up there, yeah, that's a good target, but it depends on who you are and what you're doing. And some may need less because they don't have that risk of that others do. So but margin is the tough part right now. What's my margin if I lose $20 million to $40 million out of my F&A numbers at the medical center? Now, what do I got to do to keep that margin up?
That makes sense.
And final comment I'll have is, part of the rationale of having liquidity now is because if you try to get it later when it's more costly or stressful, you may not get it. Two, if you do get it, you're being paid a lot. You need to have some degree of liquidity that gives you margin because we know we're old. Sadly old enough in that room to see, multiple cycles of credit getting tight, business conditions getting tight. So it does happen. You don't know exactly when it's going to happen. You're ready for it. Okay, final slide. Just recapping the most recent Moody's reports for the 6 institutions, not a lot of changes from last year. The one rating action we did have recently with WSU, their outlook of a strong AA3 credit, they did receive a negative outlook in February this year, primarily driven by the liquidity being significantly below peers. All their other metrics are right where they want them to be or where they should be for that rating. But they know about the liquidity. WC knows about the liquidity. Now you know about the liquidity. It's something to work on and improving. And that's the extent of my prepared remarks. Certainly be available for further discussion or any questions I can answer perhaps.
Questions for Jim? Richard Glitter.
With respect to the issue of cash reserves, how much runway do we have on the revenue side to help solve cash flow problems? That is, if we get into cash flow problems in one of our institutions, is the solution only to cut spending, or is there another way to bring more liquidity to the table? And I'm talking about a case of unexpected liquidity.
Well, I'm sure the institutions would love a board of regents line of credit that they negotiate for, but
I don't think you need to search very far.
I mean, in theory, the endowments could be a cushion to the extent that they have unrestricted assets. I mean, any number of financial tools can be done and used, whether it's a good policy or someone's willing to do it. Endowment has assets that they perhaps could leverage, establish the endowment level, feed the university with a promise to pay back. There's lots of possibilities, but usually, you're not getting anything. There's no free lunch in the process, unfortunately.
Got it. Thank you.
Can you guys level step on real quick? Do we have any debt going out to market in the next 90 days? Someplace? Is there anything? I haven't been able to think.
Thank God, no.
Yeah. So we've gotten everything out. And we do, everything's fixed, right? There's nothing that reset. Do we have any debt that resets on us coming up anytime soon?
I think we have a line of credit with Athletic that we run on, but that's about it. That's just why the stadium is being built.
We have the same line of credit on that.
Any other questions for Jim? Great information. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, moving on to item B, first read of Johnson County Educational Research Triangle budgets. Vice President, please.
Regents, you had emailed to you, and I do have hard copies for those who have interest. This is the annual process we have with the Johnson County Educational Research Triangle. And as a reminder, this is a 1/8 cent sales tax that is available to the KU Clinical Research Entity, the K-State LA campus, and the KU Edwards campus. There is a separate JCERT authority that administers the funds. And so there are some administrative costs that are retained by the authority. But for the 3 campuses, by state law, the Board of Regents must approve the upcoming year's budget. And they are all projecting, I believe it's $8.3 million in sales tax for the coming year. And so what was before you and what will be before the board, this is just for a first read for fiscal affairs this month, but before the board next month will be how the 3 campuses predict they will, or request that they will spend the $8.3 million for their approved programs. The state law does limit what the uses can be used for. So that did get expanded a little bit for K-State Olathe 2 or 3 years ago, but otherwise they've been standard over the length of the program. This was the initiative spearheaded by former Regent Fred Logan, and it's been quite a success for the 3 schools. And the information is there. If you have any questions, I know there are some folks online and here in the room who can help fill in some of the gaps.
Any questions on the J-CERT budgets for fiscal year 2026? As Vice President Frisbee said, this is just a first read. Can always ask questions at the May meeting.
And this will be approved by the JCERT board soon.
Later in April?
Yeah, later in April, so they'll be reviewing as well. They ask us questions, they approve it, but you have to keep on.
Very good. Any questions? Okay. Thank you. All right, we'll move on. We've got some of our internal auditors here to talk to us about data related to their peers. So we've got Kate Neely, Jamie Dalton.
More paper?
Yeah, more paper. Welcome.
All right, right here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I also have Jared passing here for you. And I think the rest of my colleagues, our colleagues are on the call too, so there'd be any questions. So coming out of the January Fiscal Affairs and Audit Committee, there was a follow-up item asking about resourcing, what do our staff sizes look like against our peers? So we got together and put the consolidated packet. They have it in front of you. So I'll direct you first to page 3, which it looks like most of you are on. So what we came together and decided to show was 3 different views. So one is just purely number of staff, number of audit staff within each of our offices. And then we did 2 different ratios. So full-time employees at our institutions compared to auditors, and then students compared to auditors. And page 3 shows that view for each of us, each of our K-Board institutions. So I think probably more meaningfully are the following pages. So we each did those same analyses against our K-Board approved peer and aspirational peer institutions, right? Because each of us look different, have different risk profiles, et cetera. I think what you'll find as you flip through there, some of us are right in line with our peers, right where we would expect to be. Others maybe vary a little bit. I would feel a little bit more comfortable directing any specific university questions to each of the auditors. Again, there's representation either in the room or on the call. I think maybe the final comment I'll end with as well is the professional audit standards that each of us follow, that we have to follow for K-Board policy. One of our standards is that as chief audit executive, each of us, we have a responsibility to manage resources and make sure that we have the appropriate level of resources to serve our institutions and to address the risk at each of our institutions. And so that does look different, again, for each of us. And we also have an obligation to report as to the appropriateness of those resources to senior leadership, as well as to the audit committee, which I think you may have noticed in each of our individual presentations between November, December, January, that each of us have made statements as such.
I know we've talked previously about the need for cross-training so that if you lose someone, you maybe see a little bit of a disruption, but it doesn't just stop everything.
Right.
Seeing that 4 of our 6 institutions have 1.5 FTEs or less in their audit staff, how are we able to cross-train and provide some redundancy to ensure that we don't have all of our eggs in one basket?
Yeah,
I guess I would
that's a great question. I may let.
maybe, yeah, one of those, if one of those 4 could respond to that and maybe shed some light, I'd appreciate it.
And maybe at the risk of calling any of them out, I know some have specific plans in place for that. Again, I don't want to speak to their specific plans. Others also use graduate interns that kind of help as there are fluctuations, but I may leave that to our smaller shop.
We have Chris Kavanaugh on as well as Tammy Norman.
I'm here and our plan is, and it was reflected in the audit presentation, is that I utilize grad assistants, but when it comes time for me to leave, there's a plan in place to do like phased retirement, and I plan on staying there until the transition would be complete.
Thank you.
Yes, likewise at Wichita, I'm near I can see the end of my career on the horizon, and I've talked to Rick about first hiring my replacement by the end of FY 26, and then providing some overlap as after we hire a new director, and then looking then for another senior auditor that the new director would hire to get us back up to 2 auditors, similar to like Portland State University and Cleveland State University has.
Okay.
We've had those discussions, and the plan is in place.
Okay. Thank you.
Pittsburgh State, I would say, similar to what my colleagues are saying. If it was a planned stepping away from the role for whatever reason, then there is time to figure that out with administration and have something in place to cover. If more unplanned, this probably addresses your question as well, and that one's a little.
Sure.
And Jamie, I could add a couple of thoughts to that. I mean, we've gone through 2 auditor transitions in the last, I think, 3 years or so. One was planned, one was not planned. And so we've kind of experienced that firsthand several times, and we've leveraged different groups of people to help fill in those educational and transitional roles that are needed, right? The finance staff within the business office and the purchasing team and others to help educate the new auditor on systems and processes and tools, the other auditors in the system to help educate on standards and techniques and audit approaches. And then we've been fortunate to be able to reach out to the prior auditor in both cases as another resource during that transition period. I would also add that while continuity and transition processes are helpful in any area, it's probably less taxing in an audit environment than it might be in a lot of other environments, right? Audit's so project oriented where they're tackling new challenges and new issues with almost every project. There's not as much continuity as there is in many other functions.
Okay.
We've also recently moved institutional compliance office, so that role now reports to me. So while they're not counted as audit, they're not really helping me do audit, they certainly could step in if there were needs and understand the practices needed.
Thank you.
For the 3 regional institutions, there's a number of peers who outsource. Is that, seems like it's common at that size institution? Is that anything you've ever looked at?
I'll speak for us. You might want to add, I mean, I noticed that in the data as well. I don't think we've ever seriously explored that or considered that. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. So it's certainly something to consider. Imagine the time and effort that we would get for the amount of money we would spend would go down in that situation. So there's a trade-off there. But it's something worth considering, right? Another variation of that might be, there's nothing that would prevent the 3 regionals from working together even more tightly than they do today and sharing those audit resources to, if nothing else, leverage expertise that the 3 may have that's unique and different from the others. That'd be kind of a variation on that thing as well that I'd be interested in exploring in the near future.
Yeah, for us at Fort Hays, I mean, we did look at that and thought about that. I don't think we've ever seriously considered that in the past either, but this report did sort of shine a light on it. I talked with Baron, who's helping with the internal audit right now, and we kind of looked at where is that threshold? Where does it become better to have somebody in-house versus outsourcing? And we think we're probably right near the edge. It's about 1,000 to 1 on the employee side of things, somewhere in that area when you look at the trend. And so I don't know if that's better for us or not, but it was a conversation we had because of this.
Argument to be made on different sides, but it would be an interesting investigation. But in a regional institution, it does also help to build relationships when you're here and part of the team. So it is kind of different. There's bonuses on both sides.
In undertaking this study, did you come across how many or what percentage of universities actually have an actual external audit? That is, audits by a separate entity, not housed in the university or the region or the board office. Is that a thing? I say that because in the banking context, you have internal audits and you have external audits. And external audits have to be external. You cannot use your own people to do an external audit.
Yeah, we didn't look at that specifically in my experience, and just from general knowledge. The external audits are going to typically be financial statement audits, which again, for internal audit, we're all typically looking more at processes, efficiencies, compliance. So it's complementary to each other, where we can place some level of reliance on when there are external audits. I know, each of our institutions go through external audits to some degree, particularly each of our controlled affiliated corporations are required to have an external financial audit. And so at KU, we work closely with the CFO or the appropriate individual of the controlled affiliates to understand what are those findings, what have they seen, what are their procedures to see whether we need to learn anything about the risk landscape there. But I don't know that we really saw probably what you're thinking of with that true external audit that you would see like in the private industry. That's not something that's typical outside of financial statement audit.
Thank you.
And we do get kind of an audit by the state that's a self-assessment of internal controls that has you look at your own processes and questions that. So it's a form of an external.
Sure.
So in a perfect world with unlimited budget and all those kind of things, you gave us a number of ratios to look at. Which one of these is the most important one in this, and what would your audit department look like?
That's like, I think that's going to vary for each of us, quite honestly. And maybe my first part of my answer will seem like a non-answer, but I think to get to what that is in the perfect world, it's why it's so important to the policy that was approved last fall that had a requirement for risk management at each institution. I think that's why it's so important to have institutional level enterprise risk management, risk assessment, so that each of our institutions are laying out what are the top priorities, what are the top risks, and how can audit support and provide coverage of those risks, right? Because that's really, we're here to serve the institution and meet the needs of senior leadership in the audit committee to address those high priority risks at each institution. I think, when I personally for KU, if I were to pick one of those charts, it's going to be audit staff. As I just knowing and probably taking into account, not necessarily, enrollment size is important, but we're looking at which of our peer institutions have an academic medical center, who is similar in terms of research expenditures, and the type of research that's happening. We're looking at that risk landscape, and then the type of resources within those numbers. So we're looking at how many IT auditors are there at our peers, et cetera. So I'm not sure that I can tell you the ideal number. At KU, we're typically looking at staff size and type of resource. knowing too that if there's a high priority risk that our senior leadership really wants us to cover and we don't have the resources for it, we always have the option to outsource or co-source for a specific project. And so yeah, it can even change, right? I think we're changing how we think about risk even within the last 6 months. So I apologize for the non-answer because it's kind of that. It depends.
Appreciate that.
Any other questions for our internal auditors? Great information. Yeah, thank you again. All right, item D, review board agenda items under fiscal affairs. Vice President Lisby, I think the only one we have this afternoon will be Director Bristow's report related to the capital improvement request and the 5-year plans for fiscal year 2027.
Yes, that's the only item for discussion. There are, of course, the items on consent, pages 40 to 43. And I wanted to highlight page 44. We didn't really cover this in our fiscal affairs agenda call because this really falls under governance, but it is an important topic related to IT standards in state universities. So what you have on your discussion for this afternoon on consent for IT is a formalization of what we've already been working toward. We're doing the audit to see where everybody is compared to the NIST framework for cybersecurity. And those results should be coming through in a little bit. And then this just formally adopts that as the standard and policy, just to put a little dot on the I for us there. Otherwise, the capital projects and the land transactions are noted on the consent agenda, which we went through on the call 2 weeks ago.
Thank you for that. Any questions or conversations related to the consent agenda items? If not, I know the full board appreciates knowing that we recommended approval of those. And we entertain a motion as such.
So move.
Okay, motion by Regent Rolfe, second by Regent Winter. All those in favor say aye. Pardon me.
Just so we don't have to correct the minutes next
Sorry,
week.
John.
I need.
I rescind the
You
second
can,
from
you
Regent
can leave
Winter.
it as you said.
I don't want to second it. Very
You gotta
controversial.
vote on it.
I think it passed. I'm not sure. We'll wait, read Elaine's minutes. All right. Vice President Frisbee, any state university capital renewal initiative? You or Director Bristow, any items this morning?
Well, we have the update on how we are proposing to address the budget overage. So I don't know, Chad, if you want to talk a little bit about that, just briefly.
The policy, introduce the concept or?
Just, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so Regent Dykes and Regent Benson for the agenda call. One idea that we have had an opportunity to discuss with COBO individually is raising the delegated authority approval cost thresholds. That would, looking at the last year, let's say approximately reduce the number of amendments that came to the board by say, 12 to 15, let's say. Would also expedite a certain number of projects on campus, depending on what that amount is. And we have some proposed amounts that we can submit to you formally, but if you raise it to the small cap, large cap project fund, I think that would make it a lot easier for the universities to just expedite those small projects, which represent about 80% of all projects that they do in terms of number of projects annually. And then raise that middle tier that's delegated to president and CEO, and then maybe have an upper tier of high profile, high dollar projects that come to the board that you're looking at the programs, fielding the amendments and changes to those. So that would conceptually, I think, address the concerns that always and have been discussed.
Okay, thank you.
Last handout of the
Your
day.
suggestion, do you have any questions or comments?
Me?
No. John Dykes that mentioned it on the agenda.
I just, I'm all for the expedited, when we look at how often these projects come back and any delays that builds into the process when, You look at, what we've dealt with over the last 4 years, construction costs. I mean, if we were meeting it today based on Jim's presentation, if it delayed the time frame that you happen to go to market for any kind of municipal financing, if it has delayed you from early March to mid-April, can you even do the project anymore? So anything that we can do to expedite the process for the universities, I'm all in favor of. Now, since we have internal auditors here today, are they comfortable with this?
Silence speaks loudly.
I'm not sure I'm prepared to use that.
Okay, that was a little quick, man. Now, are the CFOs comfortable with what is being proposed here?
Doug isn't here, but we haven't discussed it as a group. We've been discussing individually. But the proposal is basically to say, you can do whatever you can do up to the limit. And then another one, there's an expanded role for the president, President Flanders to approve. And then if there's a certain overage of above that threshold, you don't have to come forward. So I think it helps, gives us flexibility as long as you're comfortable delegating that to the university. So that's really the question. Are you comfortable that we're responsible enough? I clearly think we are, but it's really just saying.
Some of you, but we're not.
Smaller stuff you go forward within the limits. Another level, the president has to review along with Chad. And then if it's over 10%, I think it was a proposal at some point.
Oh, yeah, actually, Jeff, I don't know if you mind elaborating on that.
Yeah, if it's more than a 10% change from the original program statement, you have to bring it forward. But if it's less than that, you can. I think these are all. So yes, I think I speak for myself. I can't speak for the rest of the group. It would expedite some things. And if it's really big, you should see it again anyway. Just change something.
Yeah.
Did I get that right, Chad?
We'll look at it next month, is what you're saying?
Yeah, we could
Yeah.
formalize this and bring it to Kobo, make sure that everybody is in agreement, and ready to see it.
Work the process. I think that's what's important on the change.
Agreed.
All right, Wesley, do you, any thoughts you both have?
No, I mean, I talked with Chad about it. I agree with what's been said here. I think generally speaking, it will be helpful. I agree with what Gus said. It's really how comfortable are you to trusting that all of the teams, and it's not just the people at the table, it's the institution, right? The presidents are involved, everybody's involved.
Yeah,
That we're gonna do it the right
I
way.
really hesitate to frame this up of how much do we trust you guys?
Sure.
Like, this is creating trust for the public.
Yeah.
Right,
totally.
and so it's, I mean, we have a high degree of trust in the teams at our universities, and I don't think that's the right way to frame this up. So do we have a process that has enough checks and balances with the people's money that they can feel good that we're stewarding appropriately, and we can show that without creating too much bureaucracy, and all that. So I think that's just the frame of mind for me as we look at it. It's like, do we have enough that, we should assume we're hiring really competent people that can do this. I want to be careful.
And I think on that note, it is not like you can do it and no one ever is going to see it. We're going to be reporting. So if you up the limit to that level, there's reporting that we're required to do to tell you, and you can go back and go, we're going to pull that back because we don't agree with what you did. So it does have a follow-up element to it, even if it's expanded. And geez, what do things cost versus what they did 10 years ago when you saw the same limits? I mean, there's that kind of discussion. Right?
Yes. And I've got more faith in you and your teams knowing what is right for your university than necessarily us coming in and blessing it with, the information that maybe we get versus everything you all know. So, and if we can expedite things that make projects come to fruition quicker and cheaper, we all win. And I think that does then what John is saying about we're being good stewards of the public's money.
Look forward to that recommended policy in May, and we'll go from there. So thanks for all your work on that. All right, Vice President Frisbee, audit findings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this month, we have the results from the state of Kansas single audit. I think it was in January, we talked a little bit about state university findings in the financial audit that was published in December. The follow-up then to the state's financial audit is the state single audit, which was released in March. There's a refresher there in your handout. The state of Kansas in fiscal year 2024 received over $8 billion in federal funding. Of that $8 billion, just over $1 billion was from the U.S. Department of Education. And of that $1.2 billion, $502 million was for post-secondary student financial aid. Now that, about $400 million was for direct student loans and about $87 million for Pell Grants. So every third year, when the external auditor comes in and does the external financial audit, they also do a review of how major clusters of programs are reviewed. They do that every year, but every third year, they look at student financial aid. So in 2018, they looked at student financial aid, 2024 and was the most recent year. And we did have some findings for the state universities. They're going to sound very familiar if you think back to the discussions we had with several of the two-year colleges where they had some findings in their audit for how they administer financial aid. Very much focusing on minute details for how Department of Ed when a student withdraws, for example, and their student loan is changed in some fashion. So what you have below on the front page is just a very brief summary of how the findings were characterized. In no case did the auditor question any of the costs for how the funding was used. It was very procedural in how they set up the findings. So what you have are pages extracted from the state single audit, which are published every year on the Department of Administration's website, along with the university's response and their action plan that they're taking to every time you get a finding, you have to have your corrective response. So that's just provided to you. I had an opportunity 2 or 3 weeks ago to talk with some of the university financial aid folks, and they were not as directly involved in this process. I didn't get a chance to talk to many of the directors, but feel confident that they're going to keep working on their processes to change this. So we're doing what we need to do to handle those federal financial aid dollars. So if anybody has any questions, or you can follow up at our next meeting on that.
And if I understand correctly, even one instance could trigger a fine.
Yes, so they will go and sample students. So they might sample 40 students and find one student that wasn't handled correctly, and that's a finding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the information. Any questions for Vice President Frisbee?
Sure.
Yes.
This may or may not be for Vice President Frisbee. What's the update as far as we can tell from media and other sources about the future of funding for Congress from Pell Grants and other financial aid things?
Honestly, I'm not sure I have a recent update. I don't know. I have not tracked that closely. I know there's discussion of moving the function for administering student loans to the Small Business Administration, but where Pell Grants are landing, I don't know if that will move perhaps to the U.S. Department of Labor. There's some discussion about where some of the education functions that we interact with might move to labor, but I don't know about Pell Grants. Does anybody else? We can research that though.
I had read a media report back, about these cuts where all these federal government cuts were discussed. That where they quoted the Secretary of Education as saying she was in support of continuing Pell Grants, and I think other areas. I just wondered if there's any more depth to that,
We'll find out.
issue. Okay, that's an extremely important to us in higher education.
Any other business to come before the committee this morning? No, appreciate everybody's time. Yes. Commissioner Hall.
Elaine, on the audit findings, how long before it's a formal notice that the auditor believes things have been resolved? Is there a timeframe on that?
Well, so this cluster of programs, there are some that the auditor looks at every year. So if you think of the big programs, Medicaid and childcare funding for SRS, or now DCF, some of those get examined every year. This only gets examined every third year.
Yeah, no, I just mean like, okay, they have finding, you give back your response and then they have a certain amount of time. Like, is it 60 days to give your response and they have 60 days to give their response? Like,
I'm not sure in this case that it's just a 60-day timeline. I think it's a longer one, but we could see that.
yeah, I'm just curious.
And generally, they would follow up next year to confirm if the agreed upon actions have been put into place. Now, whether they test that or not, I'm not sure, but they'll at least inquire.
So there's not ever a time when you can say that the matters in everybody's mind has sufficiently been resolved.
I mean,
I
Just years on
think
it.
most of them are, well, this person graduated and we didn't record this, so
Yeah.
we change the procedure immediately. And say, well, we didn't.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, do you ever get notes back from them? Hey, great, that action, that's enough.
Yeah.
Curious.
Probably no news is good news.
Yeah, well, every office.
Anything else this morning?
Do we have any feedback, your thoughts, opinions on the budget that was passed? Going back from last July
Thank you
to
for the pay raise.
now, any impacts drastic that we need to know about, on any of you individually? From where we started the process in July to where it ended in April.
So from an operations standpoint, obviously, the legislative session began with an exercise of how do you cut 7.5% from your budget, right? And luckily then we ended up with a flat operations budget, which, thanks for not cutting us, I guess. But it does not address the real impacts and the real needs that we have as institutions in our operations, right? And I think that's where we continue to struggle with. We've got inflationary impacts, we've got salary compression and under market. And so, it's great that it wasn't reduced, but we still have real needs out there to help, supplement our operations. Pay plan is great. But again, the other side of the coin though is they only give you enough of the pay plan to fund your state funded positions. You still have to find all the other funding that comes along with that. So,
Example for us, it's 7.7 to give everybody 2.5%. We got 4.5 from the state. So you have to make that up.
yeah,
And then you got 0 on everything else. Then inflation has that.
Yeah.
So it's better than nothing, it's better than the cut,
right.
but we have to figure out what to do.
Really disappointed there wasn't, it sounds like we're real negative, or I'm being real negative on it, but the reality is this is kind of where we're struggling too. I'm disappointed there wasn't funding provided for cybersecurity. There's such a huge need on that, and we've been successful the last couple of years to get some additional dollars, and for nothing to come through this year, I think it just puts the whole system back, not just each individual person. So those are just some initial thoughts, but overall, we're happy that there wasn't a reduction in funding.
With respect to what we used to call other operating expense or OE, that still has some validity. Where did you all end up with respect to more or less or the same in your OE budgets?
0, we got 0.
Flat.
So anything you do in that regard has got to be taken away from some place A and put in place B. And you got no inflationary adjustment.
We'll get tuition proposals soon. So,
Setting the stage.
Anything else this morning? That's right.
Wait,
No, that was not.
No,
Yeah,
no,
okay.
I need cut off.
All right, here's a second for adjournment.
We will stand adjourned.
Okay.
Thank you all.